Hi, guys. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Okay, okay. Good. Yeah,
Great.
absolutely.
Okay. So great to see everybody. So this week we're coming upon Vayishlach, and we're kind of finishing up this episode of the cosmic showdowns between Yaakov and Esav. So I want to kind of tie together and take a step back. We've been looking at this in the past couple of weeks from all different angles. I want to kind of take a step back and try to understand sort of what this whole story is about, kind of what do we walk away with at the end of this sort of fight and then reconciliation between Yaakov and Esav. So, there's so much that we talked about the blessings and stealing the blessings and who's the firstborn and who's going to get which blessing. There's blessings and then there's like consolation prize blessings. What's actually going on here? So when you go back and you read the portion of Toldot carefully, you see there are actually two distinct mini storylines that are tied together. Each one of them could conceptually actually stand alone. Like imagine this, the story could have been easily, Asa was out hunting, he got hungry, traded his soup, now he's not the firstborn anymore, his parents hate his wives, and then they send Yaakov to get married in Haran and they give him a blessing and he lives happily ever after, right? That story, just standing alone, would have worked just fine. Now, um, you don't need even the story of the stealing the blessings to explain anything. The story would have been fine. And then you could tell a totally different story. You could have told a story like this. Rivka loved Yaakov. Yitzchak loved Esav. She hears that Yitzchak is going to bless Esav. Yaakov steals the blessings. Esav gets so mad. Rivka sends him away and he leaves. That would have also been a totally sensible story that would have all made sense. And then Yaakov ends up in Haran and with Lavan, and that the whole story would have worked. It's like there are two parallel stories taking place. What are the, it's like two distinct lines of blessing that each one of them has its own characteristics. So if we actually break it down, I think that when we read carefully, what we see is that there's a real distinction between the blessing, which is called the bracha, and the firstbornship, which is called the bechora. The bechora, the firstbornship, is the spiritual mantle. That is the lineage of Abraham going down through the generations. Now, there's another blessing here that is called throughout the parsha of the bracha, the blessing, which is primarily of physical abundance. Now, how do I know this? Because when Esav takes the soup, he says, I'm going to die. Why do I need this firstbornship? Now, if that was referring to some sort of blessing of physical abundance, then of course Esav would have wanted it. Do you know how much soup you could buy with physical abundance? But obviously, he's saying, I want soup, I want physical things. What do I need this spiritual thing that I don't really understand? I'm going to die. It doesn't mean he's going to die at that moment. I'm just a physical being. I'm going to die. Why do I need spiritual promises of things I'm not ever going to even live to see or ever enjoy? And secondly, later when he's crying, after he realizes that his father blessed Yaakov and not him, he says, he's crying and he goes, Yaakov tricked me twice. First, he took my bechorah, my firstbornship, and now he's taking my bracha, my blessing, meaning Esav himself sees that there are two distinct things that are being taken from him. Now, the real tragedy is perhaps that there was just a misunderstanding here, and we spoke about this last week, between Rivka and Yitzchak that just tears everything apart. Yitzchak himself doesn't actually seem to be confused. He seems to see each son for his strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't seem in the story that he was actually ever planning on giving the spiritual lineage of Abraham to Esav. He says, I want to bless you before I die. And then the blessing that he gives to Jacob, thinking that he's Esav, was really the blessing of abundance. He recognized that that was what Esav, that was his strength, that was his interest in the world. That's where he would do well to flourish in physical existence and physical abundance. Now, it could be that right after that, he was planning on calling Yaakov right in and giving him the blessing that works to his strength, the spiritual lineage of Abraham. But Rivka jumped the gun. She was so scared that the wrong blessing would be given to the wrong person. that she takes matters into her own hands. She doesn't actually open it up with Yitzchak and talk to him. She sends Yaakov to steal the blessing. And now it's so tragic because that causes this massive anger, which leads to this cascade of betrayal in the family, having such a, such a difficult journey. So what ends up happening is that Yaakov ends up doubling down on blessings that Yitzchak didn't actually intend to give him. Now, when we jump forward to our portion of Vayishlach, and they're coming to have this meeting as Yaakov is coming back to the land, we see this ceremonial giving of these gifts and marching all of the children to bow 7 times. What is that about? So what I want to suggest is that Yaakov is actually doing something that's very profound. Perhaps he's actually trying to roll back the stealing of the blessings, because if we look at the blessings that Yaakov took, the ones that were intended to go to Esav, the blessing really only has 2 elements. If we look at it carefully, he says, God is going to give you the dew of the heavens and the fat of the land and an abundance of grain and wine. And people are going to serve you. Nations are going to bow down to you. There are 2 main elements. One is having physical abundance, and one is having domination over everyone else. Now, when we look at the blessing intended for Yaakov, the blessing that Yitzchak gives him when he leaves, the one that can be referred to as the Bechorah, the firstbornship, it's also really specific. It's almost identical and reminiscent of the covenant that Hashem made with Abraham at the time of the circumcision. What was the blessing that Hashem gave Abraham at the time of the circumcision? It's the exact same thing almost that Yitzchak says to Yaakov. It has essentially only 3 elements. It says, I'm going to make you fruitful. You're going to have nations and kings that come from, okay, so you're going to be fruitful. There's going to be a covenant, an everlasting covenant to be your God. And I will give you the entire land of Canaan. There are 3 elements. Now, what is glaringly missing? What's glaringly missing? It's really noticeable, but there's no promise of wealth and abundance, and there's no promise that you're always going to dominate other people. On the contrary, right when Hashem makes the covenant between the parts, the Brit Ben HaBetarim, Hashem says, hey, guess what, Abraham? Some bad news. Your children are going to be slaves. Meaning Hashem deliberately does not promise Abraham abundance or that he will dominate everyone else. And it also doesn't say that any of these blessings are unconditional. They're covenantal. Hashem promised Abraham these 3 blessings, but he also said, you have to do things, for me. You have to walk before me. You have to be perfect and I'll bless you. But it's not obvious that these 2 blessings that Yitzchak wanted to give his sons are compatible with each other. Hashem deliberately did not include material blessing and domination in the Abrahamic blessing that was passed down to Yitzchak and then to Yaakov. So now Yitzchak understood that these 2 blessings are not necessarily able to kind of be together in one person. He knew which one was most appropriate for each son. But Yaakov ends up taking it all, not necessarily on purpose. And that's why Esav is so devastated. Because he says, you took everything? You took everything? Now, the fact that Yaakov gets both of these blessings led to so much rage and sorrow and breakdown in the family. And now when they're finally meeting up, what happens? Yaakov, first of all, gives him a whole bunch of his stuff that he's amassed. He's giving him his a pretty dramatic chunk of wealth. Like he's symbolically handing back over to him the first element of his father's blessing, which was they're going to be really wealthy and have this tremendous physical abundance. And then what is the second thing that they do? They have this ceremonial bowing again and again, all these bowings. What are these bowings supposed to be about? Well, if we go back to the blessing, what was the bowing? The bowing is so like hyper emphasized that the Midrash actually says that for each bow, there's going to be another subjugation to Rome because it's so strange that there's so much bowing. Why is it saying, couldn't it just say they bowed? Why does each group individually have to be described as bowing? Well, it only seems strange until you think back to the blessing, because the first part was material abundance, and the second part of the blessing was that you'll have domination, that everyone will bow down to you. The other descendants of your, this is your mother's children, all the other descendants of your parents are going to bow down to you, the receiver of the blessing. That was the blessing that was given to Yaakov instead of Esau. You even see it in the wordings. When you look at these gifts, throughout the time that Yaakov is preparing these gifts to give to Esau, they're always called a mincha, a gift. But when Esau says, don't worry, brother, I don't need it. I have plenty. Yeshli rov, I have plenty. He says, please take, he doesn't say, please take my gifts. Look carefully. He says, please take my blessing. Please take my blessing. There's nowhere else where these gifts are called a blessing until they're actually in this conversation. And Esau says, please take my blessing. It's like, don't think I'm trying to give you just a gift that's, a sweet little, like, hi gesture. I'm giving it to you as a relinquishing of the blessing in case you didn't notice what I was doing. And this conversation that they have at that moment in time is so profound, because what does Esau say? He says, Yeshli rov, I have much. Much is a word that we would use when we're referring to something physical that can be counted. Yaakov says, in response to that, Yeshli kol, I have everything. What does it mean to have everything? I have the blessing of Abraham. The only other person in the Torah who is described as being blessed with everything is Abraham. So it's like, if you haven't picked it up until now, he's saying, yes, I have all of this material abundance. I have much. Yaakov says, it's okay. You keep your much, because I have kol. I have everything. I have Abraham's blessing. And everybody ends up getting exactly what they need. Abraham and Yaakov experience this blessing of everything. What is this blessing of everything? What's the difference between having much and having everything? Well, when you have everything, everything includes the blessings and the hardships in their lives. They're integrated. They're integrated. You have everything. They live to live in an Abrahamic covenant, in an Isaac and a Jacob covenant, is to integrate into your personality, into your relationship with Hashem, this holistic existence that accepts the good and the bad as a part of this wholeness of life. And then if we look historically, like, the reality of this speaks for itself. Even in their own lives, if you look before this meeting, Yaakov actually was generating unbelievable wealth when he was living in Lavan. As long as he was bearing this original blessing that was meant for Esau, his flock just grows and grows, and the sheep are having unreasonable amount of speckled little guys for him to take, and he's doing amazing. Look what happens after the encounter with Esau. We just see that he doesn't actually have that much after that. When he sends the brothers down to Egypt, twice it says, go down to Egypt to get food from who they didn't know was Joseph, but from Egypt. He says, so we don't die of starvation. Forget about abundance. They're just trying to stay alive. Now, on the other hand, at the end of the parsha of Vayishlach, our coming parsha this week, is this long, long list of kings and kingdoms that spring forth from Esau. It says that before there was even a kingdom of Israel, all of these kings were extending from Esau, meaning they were a super developed society in terms of their material existence. While we were slaves in Egypt, Esau already had full-blown kingdoms. It's like showing you that the proof is in the pudding. The peace was made between them by setting things right as they should have been, giving the blessing to Esau and the firstbornship to Yaakov. And then throughout all of our history, you can see this as well, because you can hardly say that the Jewish people have lived off the fat of the land and that everyone bowed down to us. Like, historically speaking, Abraham's blessing is precisely what we got. We had continuity of generations, continuity of a relationship with Hashem, and a piece of land. Can you think of any other nation that can trace a continuous lineage going back thousands of years, that have practiced one religion for thousands of years and have been connected to one little geographical location for thousands of years? It's precisely that very blessing of Abraham that came true. In the Shema, we say, Vayayim Shema Tishmu. If you listen to the commandments, then you'll have rain. But we don't have any kind of unconditional promise for abundance. we have unconditional promise of relationship. And, the Torah is packed with blessings and curses that come onto us. Like, it could be amazing or it could be beyond horrible when you live in a covenant with Hashem that has a conversation where you actually live your life in connection with Hashem. When you look at Esav, who symbolically represents the Roman Empire in the Western world, you can see precisely his blessing coming into reality. The whole world was dominated by Rome. The whole world is dominated by Western culture. And this tremendous materialism and consumerism and abundance that have come with that all seem really unconditional and irrespective of their spiritual stature. You don't really see the economy dramatically changing in Western culture as, let's say, spirituality has declined. What's dramatic about this reading is that these blessings, I think, are essentially putting before every person a choice between two paths that are not really compatible at their core. Yaakov is saying, this is your blessing. I want my blessing. I want a life. And think about the courage that takes, because what he's doing is he's voluntarily letting go of a promise of a good life in favor of a promise of a life that will have everything, the good and the bad, but it'll be a relationship. And that's terrifying. He voluntarily lets go of that. He takes upon himself covenant instead of peace and quiet. And, there was a pivotal moment in my life. I've probably mentioned this a million times with my friend, Lisa. I said, how did you find your spiritual path in life? She's an amazing person. She said, one day I said, God, please correct me. I want to be good. If I step off the path, take a swack at me. And I was blown away by this courage of preferring relationship and goodness over just having things be okay, to just be able to actually say to Hashem, I want to get what I deserve. I don't want to get what I want. I want to get what I need. I want reality to be reflective of where I am spiritually, and I'll bear the burden of everything that entails. Yesterday, one of our kids, Jeremy, I didn't even tell you this story. She had a sleepover with her friends, and I told them that they could watch one movie, and they ended up staying very late after I'd already fallen asleep, and they watched two movies, which was really not okay. And she said to me, Ima, you should give me a punishment. You should take this or that privilege away from me because I didn't control myself. And I was actually more proud of that than if she had controlled herself to begin with, because she basically was saying, I am willing to accept upon myself the corrections that I need in order to develop self-control. That's better than being a person who was just born naturally having self-control. She's willing to be in a conversation with me where her material privileges are reflective of what she needs and what she deserves and not just what she wants. And so, they say, be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. I think that is really the message here of these parshas. Are you willing to give up your material comfort for a relationship with Hashem and say, I want to be in conversation? Sometimes our kids will have friends over that don't behave so nicely, and I'll let them get away with it. And if my kids aren't behaving, then I'm like, hey, I lay down the law. And they'll be like, well, you didn't tell my friend to clean up his mess and to stop having a tantrum. And I say, yeah, but it's because I don't love them so much. I love you. That's why I work so hard for you to be good. Those kids are somebody else's problem. So the Torah holds us up, these two possible paths. It's for every society, for every nation, but ultimately for every individual. There's one path that leads to Rome, that leads to Mount Seir, and there's another path that's the path to Jerusalem. There's one path where you can have much. And that's not bad per se. It just means that you're going to seek comfort and safety and happiness. And then there's another path that leads you to everything. That's the everything. That's the everything of Abraham, because everything is going to be thrown at you to make sure you become who you can become. And you want to voluntarily go on that road to goodness, to meaning, to growth, to Jerusalem, to the blessing of Abraham. So with that, I wish you guys a beautiful, blessed week.